We're here today with the authors of a book entitled Black and White, Disrupting Racism One Friendship at a Time, Teesha, Hadra, and John Hambrick. Personally, I think racism is one of our society's biggest issues, and it's one I'm trying to help address. Teesha is the daughter of Jamaican parents and has a Juris Doctor from the University of Florida. She practiced law for 7 years before leaving to begin a full-time ministry in 2013 at Buckhead Church, an urban campus of North Point Community Church in Atlanta. In 2016, she began working on an MDiv at Fuller Theological Seminary, where she also works as a grant project involving innovation and vocation. She currently serves as executive pastor at the Church of the Resurrection, an Anglican parish in Los Angeles. John Hambrick is ordained in the PCUSA denomination. He earned a BA degree at Pepperdine and an MDiv from Fuller and a doctorate from Columbia Seminary. Since 2004, he served at Buckhead Church, and that's where he and Teesha met and began to work together. So you can learn more about Teesha, John, and the book on the Abingdon Press website. Their book has just been published a little while ago now by Abingdon Press. So Teesha and John, so wonderful to have you join us, and thanks so much for writing this book.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yep, we're glad to be here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, as I mentioned, this is a very important topic to me, and I was so glad to hear about your book. And I've read it. I want to help our audience learn more about you all and the book. So before we get into the new book, maybe each of you could just spend a little bit of time sharing about your background more than what I had the opportunity to do. So Teesha, you want to start off with that?
Yeah, sure. So, as you mentioned, I like you, that I am in a second career. And so I started out as an attorney and practiced for a number of years before making the shift or the transition into vocational ministry. And so I've been doing that for a number of years. And I currently am actually the rector of a church in Los Angeles, that same church, Church of the Resurrection. So rector is like Anglican speak for lead pastor.
Oh, okay.
But in terms of my background, I grew up in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in like a very diverse area and part of the country and in a very diverse environment. And so I'm grateful for the ways that is and always has been a part of my story and has shaped me. And so I'm married and my husband and I live here in LA, and it's not snowing even though it's February. So we feel pretty blessed about that.
Awesome. Yes, absolutely. John, how about you?
Well, I'm a third generation Southern Californian and grew up in Ventura, which is on the beach about an hour north of Los Angeles. And while Southern California is a very racially diverse place, I managed to exist in somewhat of a white bubble in the midst of all that. And I never really thought much about racism personally. That was always something that battle was something going on some other place and just didn't seem to have a lot to do with me personally. And even after I became a Christian, on paper, I certainly realized that racism was opposed to everything having to do with the gospel. I just was not very involved. It just seemed like somebody else's battle. That all changed when I went to Pepperdine and I met a guy named Bobby Heron. And Bobby was a black guy who had walked onto the volleyball team at Pepperdine. He's a tremendous athlete. He also happened to surf. And I surfed as well. That's one reason one goes to Pepperdine, because it's right across the street from the Pacific Ocean. So we met at an InterVarsity chapter meeting, and we just kind of hit it off, and we started surfing together. And this is back a long time ago. I suppose today they have apps to help you find waves. Back in the late 1970s, you had to get in the car and drive up and down the coast looking for surfable waves. And the reason I bring that up is because we spent a lot of time together talking. I began to see the world I still have a long ways to go, but I began to understand a tiny bit about what it was like to be a black person in Southern California. And Bobby and I grew to be great friends. we trusted each other. And so I heard a lot of things for the very first time. And for me, I was the first white guy he had told a lot of this stuff. And it just, as Teesha has heard me say more than once, I didn't have a great deal of empathy for Black people until I started to care deeply about a Black person. And that was the catalyst that God used to kind of launch me into this issue. And I'm embarrassed to say my progress has not been consistent. There's times when I sprinted ahead and times when I've just sort of disengaged. But it was because I became a good friend of Bobby's that I began to be involved in this. And, Bobby changed my life in ways that I'm sure he doesn't know today because I haven't seen him in a long time. So.
And then you made your way to Atlanta.
Well, yeah, I grew up, as I said, in Ventura, went to Pepperdine, went to Fuller, as you mentioned, worked in a Presbyterian church with high school students for a number of years, worked for Young Life for a number of years. In October of 1992, my wife and two little kids, we hopped on a plane and moved to London, England, and worked there for 5 years. Then we thought we would move back to Ventura. God said, actually, I have another idea. I got a job in Atlanta at a big Presbyterian church, was there for 5 years, rolled off staff, went back to school, then started at Buckhead. And that's when I had the good fortune to meet Teesha, who has become a dear friend. And as we started to get to know each other, started to get to trust each other, we began to talk about racial issues. And Teesha knows this because I told her before, but God used her in some significant ways in my life just to open my eyes. And she's been so kind and patient with my, at times, stumbling efforts to understand things. But Teesha's been a huge influence in my life. And when we had a chance to write this book together, that was just a wonderful opportunity. So she knows this, but I'm super grateful for all of that.
So cool. Well, one of the other authors I interviewed a while back is Robert P. Jones, and he works for a company called PRRI. They do a lot of like religion-related research, market research. And he told me that one of their surveys had found that 75% of, I don't know if it was white Americans in general or white evangelical Americans. I'm sorry, I don't remember which one. But 75% did not have a meaningful relationship with anyone that was African American. Just kind of superficial relationships, not any kind of meaningful relationships. So, to the point of your guys' book and, what you've been saying, how can you possibly understand someone or some group of people if you don't even know them well?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you made that distinction as well, Brian, like to have a superficial relationship versus a real relationship or a deep relationship. I think we can sort of think to ourselves, like you've heard that adage, well, I have Black friends. And so I'm sort of not a part of the problem. I mean, that exposes a couple of issues, but one of them is just the ways in which there is a need for deep and real connection. I'm sort of reminded of even what Paul says when he says he's describing sort of what love looks like in community. And he says, weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. There's a deep sense of connection and knowing that has to precede that kind of intimacy and that kind of knowledge of the other person to the point where their pain becomes your pain. And that, I think, is the space where God can catalyze us then to action. I mean, that's what I think John and I saw even in our own relationship. And there's much more to say about that, but.
And, I'll have to say, and Brian, feel free to edit out my comments. You'll have probably much more work to do with me than with Teesha's part of this conversation. But I have to say something at this point. If you live in Atlanta, Georgia, you're a white guy, you got to work pretty hard to not have any significant Black friendships. And I think the fact that so many people don't have those in and of itself is significant. I mean, I think that's illustrative of the fact that there's something involved that's prohibiting that from happening, because it's so, if you're open and willing, it's so easy. And just because it is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, and to add to that too, John, I think even when you think about the systems of segregation that were in place, like if you read the book, The Color of Law, which is a wonderful book about, I mean, it's not a wonderful book. It's a helpful book, I should say. It's a sad and tragic story of how the practice of redlining impacted and prevented many Black families from becoming homeowners, and sort of created then these segregated neighborhoods. And so how those systems of segregation remain in place, how they continue to impact our relationships even today, and how in many ways we have sort of given ourselves over to those systems and accepted the societies that those systems have constructed. And so we remain in kind of these social and political and racial silos.
Yeah, we kind of assume a passive stance in that regard. A lot of white people, like, the famous phrase is, well, I'm not a racist. But then you ask, well, that's great. That's a good start. But what are you, is that it? Is that all you have to say? I'm not a racist? I mean, the bar is very low if that's all you have to say.
Indeed.
But then you start to, and I don't want to be a jerk about this, but, you gently start to probe and ask my white friends, well, that's good. You're not a racist. What are you doing to defeat racism in your life and in the life of the city? And boy, so many white people say, well, they don't have anything to say beyond, I'm not a racist. And if you pressed, my son has a great quote. He says, Dad, if you push too hard, you hit the off button. And sometimes I'll feel like I'm starting to push a little too hard and people just shut down. And all of a sudden they don't want to talk about this. They'll say, can we talk about something else? Or, are you trying to make me feel guilty? Or so, there's this phrase that I think I heard from Teesha initially. And of course it's very common now, with this idea of white fragility. And man, there's a lot of white folks.
Well, there's a very good book by that title.
Yeah.
Robin DiAngelo, that I have quoted from a lot.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And it's real, and it's a problem. The reason we're not further along the road towards reconciliation is because of that, I think. That's one of the reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another book that I've quoted a lot from called Good White Racist, right? That gets into this whole issue of, kind of the preponderance of white people that, think that everything's okay, that they're not the issue, whatever. So we've talked a lot about this issue. We've talked about your guys' friendship. How did the actual book itself come about? Whose idea was it? What form did it take? How did you get Abingdon to publish it? All those kinds of things.
Oh boy. John, do you want to, you take that one, and then I'll come back with a little commentary.
Well, I started writing. I wrote a lot early in my career. I didn't write any books, but I wrote chapters in books and study guides and stuff. And then I felt like God saying, hey, I need you to start writing again. So I wrote a book, first book, and that was done. And now I said, okay, so what do I want to write about now? And I was very involved in this conversation about racism at this point at Buckhead Church and in Atlanta. And I said, I want to write about racism. And I had a couple of ideas, and I pitched them to the company that published my first book. And they said, well, John, it would be much more interesting if you would write this with a Black person. And after, I paused to stoop down and pick up my ego, I started to go, well, who who could I do that with? And it took me about 10 seconds to realize, well, Teesha would be the perfect person to write this book with.
Mm.
We had this deep, rich friendship and trust which had allowed us to begin to talk about these things. So I called Teesha right away. I said, "Hey, Teesha, are you sitting down?" And I told her what I wanted to do, and Teesha, didn't you take about a week to think about it?
Yeah, something like that. At the time, I was in seminary, and it sounded like a crazy idea, honestly, to try to tackle a topic that was so hot, so controversial. But as I just stepped back and took some time to pray and talk to people that I trusted, I just knew that God was calling us to tell this story and to share our own experiences for, I don't know, just for the sake of whoever might pick up this book and have the ability to see how God might want to use them in this huge human problem. And so I said yes. And so John and I embarked on this. I was living in California. He was in Atlanta, in this like bi-coastal effort to co-write a book. And it was a really wonderful experience. I think what we kind of discovered was that we had already built we'd been friends for many years at that point, and like real friends, John and I always have had a standing phone call and always on our calendars, and John did my wedding and things like that. But the book really, the process of writing the book, like exemplified what we were writing about, because it required us to kind of dive back in and explore our relationship more deeply, have additional conversations, both personal and theological, again, and more deeply. And so it's almost like we were proving out our point in the process of writing the book, which I think was a real encouragement.
Absolutely. And Brian, you know how this works. Once we had kind of a annotated table of contents and a couple of chapters, Brian, as you know, unless you're famous, Teesha will be someday, but my shot at that, I think, is pretty much gone. But you have to have an agent. You can't just send stuff to a publisher. So praise God for our agent, Blythe Daniel. We pitched her the idea. She took it and ran with it. And, after the prerequisite number of rejections, Abington said, "We'd like to publish this." And we were ecstatic. And, they're a publisher of repute. And we were just thrilled.
Yeah, they were wonderful to work with.
It sounded like you worked with Lauren Winter too.
Yeah, we did. She was so wonderful. We're so grateful for her contributions to refining and making the book better. I think one of the things that we really wanted to make sure of was that the book captured both of our voices in a way that was useful and not distracting, that was, could still be edifying. And prayerfully, I hope that we managed to do that. But yeah, we're grateful for Lauren's contributions. She's a very talented author.
Absolutely. And she has this knack of being very clear about what we need to change. I don't recall her ever making me feel less than or bad or what on earth were you thinking. She was just wonderful to work with. And I think she pulled our best work out of us.
Agreed. Yeah. Mostly she'd give a comment. You'd be like, yeah, that's right. You're right.
No, she's really talented, and I can imagine she'd be great to work with. Lauren has spoken at a couple of our conferences, Writing for Your Life conferences in the past. So, I know her pretty well and have great respect for her work. I was really glad to hear that you all had worked with her.
Yeah, it was a gift. So
for sure.
So can you tell folks a little bit about how the book is organized?
Sure. Teesha, you want to take this? You
Yeah.
want to do it?
Well, we wanted to tackle the book at various levels, both looking at interweaving like our stories and who we are and our own experiences, while looking at some deep topics and including like theological issues and questions. And so some of the chapters are primarily sort of authored by one of us, and then the other of us would come in and add different pieces and different parts. But mostly the book is our story. It's the story of John and I, and our relationship, and how that catalyzed us to action, and how we believe that can do the same for others.
Yeah. And we wanted to write an entry level book. So somebody who's done a lot of work in this area. I don't know that we're going to present anything new to them, but our hope was that people would be drawn in by our story, our pictures on the back, like, well, this is interesting. An old white guy and a young Black woman. How does that work? And but then we wanted to do an introduction, but we also wanted to touch on a lot of the issues that are inherent in this larger conversation. And so you'll find, we talk about systemic racism.
Mm-hmm.
I think one chapter that we wrote that I feel particularly strongly about is chapter 9. It's what holds racism in place. And we tried to locate the battle against racism in the context of spiritual warfare. That this was not just a battle between human beings, but there was something else involved that needs to be referred to understand how this has been a problem for so long. Mm-hmm. And so we did things like that. And again, our hope was that we would encounter people that were new to this conversation, and that we would kind of stimulate their interest to go further and to read more and to start to get involved.
Yeah.
So, you all had the benefit of having worked together, right? For the same church, right? And so
Right.
because of that, were naturally in a relationship, of a certain type, but one where, you were pretty close because you were working together. I'd love to get your suggestions for people that may be at two different stages of relationship. One stage meaning where it's kind of back to that statistic that I was talking about earlier, where, a person a white person, I'll say that, may not really have any kind of meaningful relationship with a Black person. What do they do? What can they do to help solve that problem? That's kind of question number one. Question number two is for people that already do have meaningful relationships across, a racial boundary, what can they do to help understand each other, to help do more outside of that just one-on-one relationship to solve this bigger problem?
One of the things that we talk about in the book is the role of prayer. And so even for that first category of person, I think that's one of the first things that can so easily be overlooked is to ask God for those opportunities, to ask God to present those spaces and places where relationships can take shape. And then the other thing I would say is I've been thinking a lot about, I spent a year serving as a chaplain at a hospital in New Orleans in the midst of the pandemic. And I have been thinking a lot about that work in the context of my current role and the role of vulnerability and the ways that that's very risky. It always feels very risky to share a part of yourself with another person. And in some senses that is entirely reasonable, right? Like we can be afraid that someone might not understand us or that someone might think we're weird or whatever else. But what I've learned is that when we are vulnerable, when we sort of share our feelings, our experiences with another person, that often almost gives them permission to do the same in return. And that is that kind of meeting in the middle, like my old lawyer brain is coming back, that kind of like meeting of the minds or meeting of the hearts is a place where deep intimacy and connection can be cultivated. And so for that second category of person, I would say to pursue vulnerability as an invitation to further vulnerability from another person.
And at more than one place in the book, we talk about the fact you can't start a relationship with somebody who doesn't look like you. I suppose 1 in a million times somebody could, but the vast majority of times you can't start with this topic. Hey, I'm John. How do you feel about racism?
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, I mean, people, that's a recipe for disaster. We spent hours working together, in our job at Buckhead Church. We spent hours talking about all sorts of stuff. So we built a trusting relationship. We kind of built it. One way I heard this metaphor this morning, actually. We kind of built a bridge that was solid and sturdy that we could walk across to talk about racism. But it takes time to build that bridge. And if you try to get to this conversation prematurely, it's probably just not going to work out. And so, and also, Teesha mentioned this briefly a few minutes ago. We became friends because we're friends. Mm-hmm. Because we enjoyed each other's company. We trusted each other. We started to participate in each other's lives. We didn't build a friendship so we could write a book about this. It's a legitimate lifetime friendship. And that's the kind of context in which I think conversations about racism with somebody who doesn't look like you can really make a profound difference.
Yeah. This is very helpful. Both of your comments on this is very, very helpful, I think, to people. So now that you're looking back after having written the book, is there anything you'd change?
I 2020, this is not new, right? 2020 and 2021 were such challenging years. It's almost like a year has dropped out of our lives, like has fallen away or something like that. We're dealing with the pandemic and all of the sort of fear and uncertainty around that. And 2020 was also the year that George Floyd was killed. And then we had the country in various places erupting in protests all over the world. And so I think coming out of that, there were a number of white Christians who were catalyzed, I think, who were energized in the midst of that. But my sense is that now we're in 2022, which sounds like science fiction, but that some of that urgency has dissipated. And so I think if I were to go back, I might sort of, with knowing, what was going to happen, right? A word about sustaining that sense of urgency, like how to sustain that over a long period of time, which we touch on that, but I think there are ways that can be emphasized even more, would have been really wonderful. And I think the other thing is for people who are already clear with respect to the importance of this issue and their role in pursuing God's justice, in working alongside or participating in God's work of bringing about justice. For people who are already kind of bought into that, man, it's tiring. right? And it can be really discouraging work because it feels sometimes like, pushing a rock, a boulder up a hill. So I think something about care, like rhythms of rest and work, and remembering the ways that God is still in control of this and of all things, always, every day. And so some of those things, I think, particularly coming out of the upheavals of the last couple of years, would be important reminders.
Yeah. I, Brian, you asked about would we do anything differently? I'm of two minds about this. The subtitle, Black and White, Disrupting Racism One Friendship at a Time. On the one hand, I thought that was the perfect subtitle because it was really an apt description of what we were writing and the context from which we were writing. On the other hand, I think some people thought this book was going to be kind of lightweight because it's almost like, oh, they're talking about, friendship and
happy.
Right.
Yeah. And I think they missed the fact that, yes, we did talk about these issues from a position of friendship, and we see friendship as a tactic, as a strategy for defeating racism and disrupting racism. But I think people just assume that we weren't going to talk about anything of substance, that we weren't going to talk about some of the hard stuff. And boy, we did talk about some of the hard stuff. So I don't know how we could have captured the context, the relational context from which we wrote, and yet telegraphed to people that we were going to tackle some pretty difficult subjects as well. So, but anyway, so that's one thing I don't know if we would have changed the subtitle, but I think we might have come up with a marketing strategy that let people know, yeah, we're talking about friendship, but we're also talking about the hard stuff as well.
Yeah, it's good.
Well, whatever. We could all kind of brainstorm about other, alternative subtitles, but, things like branding and titles and things like that are very difficult for any book.
It's a great weariness.
Yeah.
So that kind of begs the question. This last part of the conversation kind of begs the question about, have you thought about doing a follow-on book?
I mean, yes and no, right? We've sort of tossed, John's always working on another book. Like, that's just a fact, right? And so we've tossed the idea around a bit. I wouldn't say that we've landed on sort of a next idea as a follow-up to this book.
I think we're certainly open to it. And we'll see. I mean, right now, Teesha alluded to this. All the film cameras are pointed at the Ukraine right now, and so almost all of them. And this particular issue is not on the front burner the way it was 2 years ago. Sadly, that will not remain to be the case, sadly. And there may be, the Spirit works in mysterious ways. There may be another issue, another situation, another opportunity, which would prompt us to write another book. So we haven't closed the door, but we haven't made any concrete plans yet.
Well, just, from my selfish perspective, as well as, what I think would help the world at large, I hope you do. Because as I said, it's such an important topic, and you guys are role models. And whatever other people can learn, from how to apply friendship more generally, how to overcome racism more generally, beyond, what you've already said or what you've already done, can't help but really helping the situation. And regardless whether, racism is on, the top news story on the evening news, who cares, right? It's still a big issue. And there are still a lot of us that want to do something about it to try to improve the situation way better than what we are at today. So
the way we
what it's
frame it,
worth.
yeah, thanks for the encouragement. The way we frame it is we think that racism is one of the most significant spiritual battles in the history of the United States.
Absolutely. I would say the most.
Mhm.
And yeah, if not the most, then certainly
Yeah.
one of the most. And so we have to keep in the, things are so contextual. And so I think we think to be a Christian in the United States, you can't not address this.
Mhm.
Really. Christian, or I would bet you could apply that to any faith that you could think of.
Yeah, any person of goodwill, we would say.
Right.
So again, I really want to thank Teesha and John for spending some time with us, but more importantly for writing this incredible book that's so important. Again, the title is Black and White, Disrupting Racism One Friendship at a Time. You can learn more about it at the Abingdon Press website, abingdonpress.com. And thank you all so much for taking the time to talk with us about this.
Thanks for having us. We're so grateful, Brian.
We are most grateful. Thank you so much.